it is my honor to introduce John Crowley, who's President and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, or BIO, the world's leading biotechnology advocacy organization, representing companies and research institutions across the world. John brings decades of experience as a biotech entrepreneur and industry leader. He's the founder and former CEO of Advocacy Therapeutics, a global biotechnology company dedicated to developing treatments for rare genetic disease. Prior to that, he co-founded Novozyme Pharmaceuticals, advancing an experimental therapy for Pompe disease, work that ultimately contributed to life-saving treatment options for patients. John's commitment to innovation is deeply personal. In 1998, 2 of his children were diagnosed with Pompe disease, a severe neuromuscular disorder. In response, he left a successful corporate career to pursue a path that few would have the courage to take, building companies, mobilizing resources in pursuit of treatments that could change the trajectory of their lives and the lives of others. His family's journey has been chronicled in the book, The Cure, and that inspired the major motion picture, Extraordinary Measures. Beyond biotech, John served as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve, including service in Afghanistan, and continues to serve on numerous boards dedicated to leadership, service, and education. John embodies the intersection of science, service, and relentless determination on behalf of patients. Please help me in welcoming John Crowley.
And both kids, it's the heart that's the real threat to their lives.
How much more time do we have?
I wish that we had a drug to treat Pompe, but we simply don't. I'm sorry.
Dr. Stonehill. Yeah. This is John Crowley. All the researchers say that you're a genius on the verge of a scientific breakthrough.
I'm not on the verge of anything.
How much would it take to prove your theory?
I promised him that we'd raise 500,000.
That's all? Is it 500 or 1,000?
500,000.
Are you totally insane?
Apparently.
Figure any dude in a business suit can help me raise venture capital and run the company, but who's going to be half as motivated as a dad who's trying to save his own kids?
Do you have a wife?
Ex-wives. 2 of them.
How come?
Because I'm so easy to get along with.
We can do this. We push ourselves. We work around the clock.
I already work around the clock.
Great. Cure diseases in theory, but never help a single human being in reality.
I can't cure your kids, you know that, but I think I can save their lives.
You're in clinical trials by the end of the year, or we pull the plug.
Nobody is going to tell me how to run my lab.
We're out of time.
Are you crazy? You've jeopardized your chances of ever getting your kids treated.
You remember you told me that I should stop chasing miracles.
Well, don't get your hopes up, kid. Say Hail Mary.
Not gonna kiss me, is he?
I will restrain him.
Thank you. Thanks so much, and Sharon, thank you to you and my great friend Barry Byrne and others at the MDA for the invitation to speak to you this morning. The MDA has played an incredibly important part of our family's journey now for more than a quarter of a century into the world of rare disease and neuromuscular diseases. The movie that you saw, the trailer, the movie came out about 15 years ago, and in many ways, the film Extraordinary Measures was a vehicle for our family to be a proxy for the many, many families and children and adults living and thriving in the world of rare diseases and the world of neuromuscular diseases with health challenges, whatever they may be, and to show in one family's journey what it takes to live, to thrive, to navigate a very complex system, to make newer and better medicines. It was an honor for our family. It gave us a vehicle to go to Washington and advocate for new legislative pathways for rare diseases, to highlight the importance of accessibility. As we heard earlier, accessibility, not just physically, but accessibility into the entire world. It was a very humbling experience, too, in many ways, when They make a movie about your life, and it includes a love scene with your wife, and the Motion Picture Association of America reviews the film. We worried about an R rating. We couldn't even get a PG-13. Referred to in that up front as a mildly suggestive moment. Also humbling when you're out with Harrison Ford and all the actors, Brendan Fraser, Kerry Russell, everybody involved in the film, and you're talking about the movie-making process, and you're talking about our family again as a proxy for so many. So I remember being at a press conference, and my then young daughter, now 29-year-old daughter, Megan, is sitting in her wheelchair at about 12 or 13 years old, and we're answering questions from about 100 reporters about life, about the movie, about medical research. And Megan, who's quite precocious, says, well, I actually have a comment. So we turned, and I, knowing Megan and Harrison Ford, having gotten to know Megan and others, got a little anxious about Megan and what she might say. And she said, well, it's a wonderful film, and she said good things, so we felt relieved. And then she said, but I do want to highlight that the film does contain perhaps the greatest exaggeration in the history of Hollywood. Now, we worked really hard to make sure they got the family dynamic, the science, the medicine 100% right. Took some liberties on compositing characters and changing locations, the business aspects of it. But we worked really hard on this film. And everybody's looking and waiting for Megan. She goes, people, it's obvious. How in the world did they cast an actor, Brendan Fraser, who's 6'5", to play my father? Yeah, she's a gem. I'll just provide some opening comments, then I know Sharon, you and I are gonna sit down and have a conversation as well, but just some opening reflections on where we are in the world of biomedical research. Where did we come from, and where are we going? Dr. Snyder, congratulations on your award, and thank you, and I was so inspired when you mentioned the world of polio. And you go back now 75 plus years where polio was the health scourge of society. It changed the fabric of our nation and the world in so many different ways. And you think about what happened, the research into the vaccine that went forward, the ability of a researcher at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center funded by what was then known as the Infantile Paralysis Foundation, what we now call the March of Dimes. The ability of a community to come together, academic research, government funding, a clinical trial in 1.5 million school children. I'd like to get that through the FDA today. To see what it took to put that as a footnote in history, and God willing, it remains a footnote. To fast forward and look at HIV and the AIDS crisis, the untold suffering and death that caused in the 1980s. And the academic research, the small companies, the large companies, everything coming together to make a first drug that went to the FDA, and the FDA was prepared to reject it. Wasn't particularly effective, terribly toxic, a drug called AZT. But it was because of patient activity and the community that had no answer. We knew exactly, without any therapeutics in HIV/AIDS, what the continued course would be. And it was courage in the system to take a risk, knowing what the alternative would be. And that first drug didn't save many lives, but what it did was open a cascade of research where all of a sudden biotechnology companies, pharmaceutical companies, more and more academic research grants, more funding at the NIH. And over the course of the next 10, 15, 20 years, we come to where we are today, where HIV/AIDS, thank God, is no longer a death sentence. It's, for most people, generally a long-term chronic managed condition. That first approval and those first series of approvals for the HIV inhibitors based on a biomarker, and that was a risk in itself. And then you go and you look at a disease like cystic fibrosis, so take it to the field of human genetic diseases. CF, similar to Duchenne muscular dystrophy, incidence of about 1 in 3 or 4,000, tens of thousands of people just here in the United States afflicted with the disease. For those of you familiar with CF, for many years, and had a kid in our grammar school who lived with it, I remember the constant worrying about getting a cold, turning into a bronchitis, into a pneumonia, into a hospitalization. Back then in the 1980s, early 90s, the life expectancy of somebody living with CF was into the teens, with an enormous amount of suffering and challenges and costs, emotional, financial, and otherwise along the way. It was a field in biotechnology that was littered with failure. After decades of work, billions of dollars, we didn't have anything to show for it. Venture capitalist funders were reluctant to put any money into the world of cystic fibrosis. It was considered a dead end, literally. Well, finally, thankfully, the academic research continued. The Cystic Fibrosis Foundation continued in its mission despite all the setbacks. Eventually, a small biotech company in Boston, Vertex Pharmaceuticals, Vertex licensed that academic research, developed that new class of drugs. When you look then at only about 14 years ago, about 2012, as the first of those drugs was finishing its clinical studies, the life expectancy had increased from 13, 14, 15 years old to about 25 years old. And that was only because of new therapies to intervene, to mitigate, to attenuate the cause of this disease. But it didn't prevent much of the suffering, didn't prevent many of the lung transplants, didn't prevent death. But when that first drug was approved, ahead of its approval date, and the FDA commissioner at the time had a scheduled hearing before a Senate committee to talk about pediatric rare disease development. And she made sure the FDA teams had the resources and concluded their scientific review and approved that first drug, again, that led to a cascade of medicines. And just in the last 13 or 14 years, that life expectancy for somebody living with cystic fibrosis has gone from about 25 years to now 70 years is the life expectancy. It went from an approval of a drug that treated a relatively small subset of mutations to now the vast majority of the many mutations that can cause CF being approved. And in the next few years, the path looks like it's going to be that people diagnosed early in life, young children, will live normal, healthy, happy lives to a life expectancy the same of any living without disease, well into their 70s, maybe early 80s. So I share some of those lessons in polio and AIDS, in cystic fibrosis, to show what it takes to make these medicines. We live this journey as well in the neuromuscular disease in Pompe. When Megan was diagnosed at 15 months of age, like many people, as you know, with any of these neuromuscular diseases, particularly those affecting children, Megan, incredibly bright, precocious, the disease doesn't affect the mind or cognitive abilities. But by about a year of age, Megan wasn't pulling up in the crib, wasn't taking those first steps. And so we went from pediatrician to neurologist, to blood test, to scan, to deep muscle biopsy. And then in March of 1998, Friday the 13th, we got the diagnosis that Megan had this rare form of a muscular dystrophy, we were told. Pompe disease, we'd never heard of it. Like most of these diseases, no history in our family. Autosomal recessive disorder. Eileen and I are silent carriers for the gene, and even then there was only a 1 in 4 chance that any of our children would have the disease. And I remember asking that neurologist, is it serious? And a terrific neurologist, we were living in California at the time, remember his hand was shaking with the papers in front of him, and he said, yes, it's very serious. And he described what the path would be. He said, Megan will soon need a feeding tube, will never walk, will need a ventilator, will get serious complications of pulmonary disease. Her heart was profoundly enlarged, the heart, of course, being a cardiac muscle, and she wouldn't live to be a couple of years old. But Megan wasn't with us at that appointment, but our 7-day-old son, Patrick, was. And the doctor looked at him and said, he needs to be tested as well because there's a 25% chance. And we quickly got Patrick tested. And it led us to this whole world of research. We met other families. We realized that as great as the challenge was in science and medicine to understand this terrible disease, to get research funding, to get scientists working on the disorder to come up with a treatment, maybe someday a cure. The other great enemy was time. And there's some irony in that, right? Time is what we were fighting for. Time with our children. Time for their lives, time to enjoy the time that children are supposed to have growing up. But it was time and the clock that was ticking away. And so we brought that sense of urgency, frankly, getting into the research world that I knew nothing about. I got a 19 on my organic chemistry final at the Naval Academy. But I had to learn, I had to meet people. Back then, there were 3 researchers in the entire world, including Dr. Byrne, working in the area of Pompe disease. We started a small little foundation. We partnered with the MDA. Our first couple of fundraisers, literally bake sales, bowl-a-thons, and then an event we did in New York City. All of that was partnered with the MDA. That provided some of that initial funding to some of those researchers. And when we realized we were running out of time, I think more out of desperation than anything, more not wanting to ever look back and wished we had done something more. We took a chance at you, Sharon, you're very kind to say I had a terrific corporate career at the time. I think it was about 1.5 years out of my MBA, with a lot of student loans and a mortgage. And so we took a home equity loan, credit card cash advances, and some of that early research money we had raised and put it into a small biotech company. And that was one part of the ecosystem that came together, from the academic research to our small company, to other small companies, eventually to a large company, Genzyme, coming up with a first-generation medicine. I tell you, we all struggle in this field. We all have more failures than successes. And sometimes it's really frustrating. I have a picture in my office that my brother-in-law had given me of that researcher, Jonas Salk, who invented that first vaccine for polio. I have a small little plaque that my mom gave me. The day that I started that small little company, it came with a letter, a little handwritten note. And it was a quote from Winston Churchill. It said simply, never, never, never quit. I didn't have an office, I had a little cubicle. I had a picture of the family on a trip to a beach in Ocean City, New Jersey, and I put that plaque, little bookmark, brass bookmark in that picture. And all those times I did want to quit, where I wasn't the smartest in the room, we didn't have money, I didn't have the experience, I realized that in some ways there was no one else who was going to step up and fill that small gap that existed. And so we had many, many tough days. Sometimes those rare moments where you actually succeed and you make a medicine that makes a difference for somebody, those are the best days, and those are the days we need to relish and hold on to, days to inspire others. Rarely, though, is it a cure, oftentimes a meaningful improvement, a treatment that extends and enhances a life, gives people more time with the people they love, quality of life, and a chance for each of you in the medical and scientific communities driven by families, caregivers, and patients to go back to the drawing board and think, okay, how do we do it again? How do we make an even better improvement until someday we get that cure? When Megan and Patrick, after lots of anxiety and drama, were finally treated in a clinical study with that first-generation enzyme replacement therapy. It's an every other week infusion. We had seen it in about 24 other children, particularly those with the severe cardiomyopathy in their disease, profoundly enlarged left sides of their heart. We waited. We saw some early signs, some energy, and by the 6th infusion, 12 weeks in, they had done some echocardiograms, they had taken x-rays, and I remember the doctor, the geneticist, walking in during the infusions, and Megan was in kindergarten, Patrick in pre-kindergarten, and they were in beds next to each other. And the doctor walked in, and she had an armful of x-rays, and she walked over and lit up the light box back in the day. And she had a smile on her face. That's usually a good sign. We hadn't seen a lot of doctors smile over those couple of years. And she put up the x-rays, and she showed the before and the after, and you didn't need to be a pediatric cardiologist to see the before, this heart that consumed most of their chest cavity, and the after, a much reduced heart. In fact, it had reduced to normal size, normal function, just 6 infusions. I'd seen that in many other children, having overseen the drug development program, but to see it in your own children and to see that. So yeah, Eileen and I kind of hugged and walked over to Megan, and she's doing her little coloring book and playing with her Barbies, and I'm trying to explain. Now, she's tough, smart, precocious, even as a kindergartner. I'm trying to explain it. And even as a 6-year-old, she's having a hard time, and I'm trying to describe a reduction in left ventricular hypertrophy to a 6-year-old. And she looks at me, and I finally just stop. And I looked at her and I said, Megan, this means means that your heart works again, and you're gonna get to live to be an old lady. And so she just put her arm around me and said, thank you. That's a good day at work, and that's the fruits of our research. And so fixing their hearts was a first step, and over time, that first year, they got much stronger. Megan was able to sit up again and raise her hand and talk more clearly. And then after about a year, those improvements, the heart always stayed strong and healthy, but over a year it plateaued and they began to slowly regress as the disease progressed. And then I realized what I thought was a small, quick journey of my life into the world of medicine and science and biotechnology would become a life's work. And so we started a second biotech company, and because the first one was successful, we didn't have to take credit card cash advances. We raised enormous amounts of venture capital, and we formed Amicus Therapeutics, a company that we formed with the work of many others over 20 years ago. And we grew that company. We developed medicines. We had more clinical trials fail than succeed. We had more diseases that we researched that failed than succeeded. But we always said we would rather be the first to fail than the last to succeed. And we did get medicines approved, next generation medicines in Fabry disease, in Pompe disease, medicines that kept extending lives, enhancing lives. And for many children in Pompe now, the future is quite bright, having that and other options. And I go back to those days 25 plus years ago where only 3 researchers in the world knew anything about this disease. We're working on it. Today, I can name more than 24 academic researchers around the world, 2 companies with approved products, 6 biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies with active development programs, with a range of therapies, some offering the hope to finally even cure this disease. And that's one example of how far we've come. It's not fast enough. It's still not nearly enough. But it's a great example of what it takes, together with the examples that I shared of CF and polio and HIV/AIDS, this virtuous circle of what it takes, grounded in our great academic research, grounded also at the NIH and through NIH grants, through small companies, entrepreneurs, startups, early stage investors, late stage investors. The great research that goes on at our academic centers often spun out to our companies, and at the end of the day, medicines and the final stages of medicines are developed by our biotechnology and our biopharmaceutical companies. Important parts of that ecosystem, but again, we would not even have the opportunity if it wasn't for academic research. It takes organizations, advocacy organizations, scientific research funding from organizations like the MDA. And the FDA, and it takes insurance companies when you get all the way up to the top to make sure that we have access. So where are we today? This year, 2026, of course, is the 250th anniversary of America. It's also the 50th anniversary of the founding of our very first biotechnology company, Genentech. And today we have thousands of biotech companies, some of which have succeeded. Oftentimes, almost always, after years of trial and error and struggle and failure, many of which are struggling today, struggling for funding. They're not struggling for funding because we don't have technologies. We've never had more hope, more technologies than we have today for a range of ailments that could prevent an enormous amount of human suffering, leading to treatments and cures. Lord knows we have enough unmet need with people who need these medicines. When you think about a basic business model, you've got the technologies, you've got people in need, you've got lots of capital. I've been through markets, the financial crisis 15 years ago, where there just was no capital for investments in anything. There's lots of capital available. So why are we struggling with many of our companies to get that capital? Because of man-made problems. It just costs too much money, takes too much time, there's too much uncertainty. Science will always be uncertain, but too much uncertainty in the regulatory process. And then after we go through all of that and run that gauntlet, now we have the uncertainty and confusion and complexity of making sure that our inventions are paid for and that patients have access, 100% access to these medicines. So at my organization that I run now, we represent about 1,000 biotechnology companies. And I've taken on the challenge to make sure that we continue to ensure that there are no barriers to innovation and that virtuous circle of innovation, but also increasingly now access. How in the world, it's as if a physician writes a prescription these days and it's a recommendation to a doctor at an insurance company who's never met the patient in need. I think like we had the 21st Century Cures Act 10 years ago, the last major piece of legislation that President Obama signed into law, bipartisan support from Republicans and Democrats, all the positive benefits of that act. We need more of that, but I'd also think now is the time for a 21st Century Access and Affordability Act. And Sharon, we sit down and be happy to share more of my thoughts. So those are just some ideas up front about where we've come from, where we are today. We've never had, again, more hope, more technologies, and so much of it coming from the work that each of you do. So I'm incredibly enthusiastic about what the years and the decades ahead can bring. In many ways, we just need to fix a lot of these man-made problems and get out of our own way and let science flourish and make sure it gets to everyone in need. So thank you, and Sharon, I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Okay, so
that's a lot for a Monday morning, sorry.
Yeah, no, that opens up a lot of topics.
And by the way, I had to tell my granddaughter, our older son, John, who actually lives with high-functioning autism, tell my almost 4-year-old granddaughter, but Papa's going on a business trip. Where are you going? Oh, I'm going to Orlando. You go to Orlando? Yeah, tough city to get to without the grandkids.
I had the same discussion with my son. So I definitely want to hear about this idea about the 21st Century Access and Affordability Act. But before we get to that, I would also think I'd like to ask a little bit about something that relates more to your personal story. And that is that, you know, we hear from, or I hear quite a bit from, I will not hit my microphone. I hear quite a bit from families who are sort of in a similar situation in that they have a diagnosis. It's often ultra rare. Of a child in their family, and there's no research, and they're trying to understand, they're building biotech companies around a kitchen table. And it was, you know, very similar to your situation. And I wonder if you could go back to your younger self and provide some advice. What would you do anything differently? What would you tell that younger self as you embarked on doing this? Because I think it's a common scenario now.
It is, and thankfully, I've had many families, as you have, Sharon, who are either actively involved in the research, have their own foundations, or more and more starting their own biotech companies. Mm-hmm. I think there are lots of advice I would give, a lot of things we would have done very differently, but maybe one piece of advice is, you know, I had this view that we had to get it done, and maybe we did, and I talked about the sense of urgency. But two things. One is to realize in many ways it is a marathon, not a sprint. You know, I would go day to day and we've got to get this done in 30 days. And yes, time was important for so many of these families and children, but also to realize that, you know, this is going to take some time. And there's only so much you could do to push the science, the medicine, the process, but look at what we could do to make it faster, more efficient, more cost effective, but just realize sometimes just take a breath and reflect back on where you've been and where you think you need to go. The other is very personal. I struggle with this at many times, separating the business that I was building in biotech from our personal lives. And of course, they're very much intertwined, but it was hard for me sometimes. You know, we'd work all week, I'd come home, and I'm still thinking about when are we gonna get the next dollar? How am I gonna hire that person? How are we ever gonna build that plant, get a drug through the FDA? And oftentimes I wasn't present enough. I may have physically been there for the kids at a park or at a birthday party or a quick trip or vacation, but I always felt that what I'm doing is so important that it even transcends that. And it didn't, and it shouldn't have, and it took me a while to realize that. So, you know, it's as best as you can kind of compartmentalize and to be present. It's even harder with our iPhones and cell phones today that I didn't have to deal with 25 years ago when the children were very young. So, and realize, thankfully for us, it has become a journey. You know, Megan and Patrick did get their medicines, the disease that had, you know, profoundly affected their muscles. They were in wheelchairs, on ventilators. Again, it fixed their heart, made them stronger for a time. Our next generation medicine made them that much stronger. But still, the disease had wrought some pretty serious, devastating effects. But despite all of that, Megan is 29, Patrick is 28. Megan went to college. She went to Notre Dame, graduated 7 years ago, got a master's in social work at UNC Chapel Hill, and she's a social worker at the Make-A-Wish Foundation today. And Patrick works in a flower shop staffed by all people with disabilities.
So a success. So I alluded a little bit in my opening remarks to this idea that our technology has really outstripped our ability to, the infrastructure to deliver drugs, to access,
yes,
whether it's affordability or the insurance industry and how we interact with that. So I assume when you talk about 21st century access and affordability, that you're sort of alluding to that problem that we really need to address some, you know, widespread institutional structural changes to make this viable.
I do. I think the whole system that has developed has just gotten too complex, and there are perverse incentives in the system that just don't fit the needs, particularly of the rare disease community, but also too when you get into treatments like Alzheimer's, cancer. More and more this age of personalized medicine is what's not fit for purpose. So while so exciting on the science front, we need to think about why are there barriers to access, and what are they, and how do we break them down? So you can look at the system, you can look at the complexity of, you know, where only half of the economics of the cost of a medicine actually go to the inventors, companies and researchers developing them. The rest are lost to middlemen in the system. So that we should simplify. And there are, both Democrats and Republicans are aware of this and supportive of ways to simplify the system, but it's beyond that. It gets to the economic barriers. Why in the world does a family, a person living with a neuromuscular disease, when we have one of these breakthrough therapies, be it an enzyme therapy, an ASO, and increasingly now gene therapies, why in the world do we have copays, co-insurance, deductibles? You know, there's that social compact. You pay your insurance premium, or if you can't afford it, it's provided to you, and you have it covered, you're covered by insurance. So that when one of these events happens, you're diagnosed with one of our diseases, and a treatment, oftentimes a miracle treatment, comes out. The whole notion of a copay was that there's shared risk, shared economics, and you know, it dates back 50, 60 years, that a patient, their family has skin in the game. Somebody living with a rare muscle disease has plenty of skin in the game, and nobody is going to take a drug because, well, hey, look, gee, I don't have a copay. I might as well just pull that off formulary, try it. It doesn't make any sense. So we'd propose that in many therapeutic areas, including the neuromuscular diseases, that there are no more copays, co-insurances, deductibles, and that it's paid for by insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies. The other are what I'll call the systemic barriers. Again, in a system of perverse incentives, you have something like step edits where, okay, you're diagnosed with a disease, there's an approved therapy, it's less expensive, why don't you try that? If that doesn't work, you fail. We see this in cancer all the time, but increasingly now in neuromuscular disease. If that doesn't work, well, then maybe we'll consider you getting the more expensive medicine. That makes no sense anymore. The whole notion even of prior authorization, if it should simply be you're diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, that's pretty black and white, right? It's binary. You have it or you do not. And there is an approved treatment approved by the FDA, and your physician writes a prescription for it, no insurance company should then be able to overrule that physician. So let's change that law as well, too.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's going to argue.
I spend a lot of time, we're based in Washington, D.C. I spend a lot of time at the White House, a lot of time on Capitol Hill these days. That's kind of a lot of what we do at Bio with our team, and it kind of reminds me the first time I had dinner with Harrison Ford. It was actually pretty cool, have dinner with Harrison Ford. We were at a restaurant in LA. It was before the 2008 presidential election, and he's not particularly political, but we just like trying to make conversation with Harrison Ford. So, and he looked at me and he said, "Well, John, you know what Washington, D.C. really is?" He's got that iconic voice, and I asked, I said, "No, Harrison, what is it?" He said, "Well, it's really just Hollywood for ugly people." So that's my job these days. But it's really important, and the advocacy, honestly, that each of you do. We just had Rare Disease Day or Week now 2 weeks ago and brought more than 1,000 advocates. I was with a senator a couple of weeks ago, and I mentioned that we had 1,000 rare disease advocates come in to Capitol Hill for a day or two. And he said, "John, that's terrific." I said, "Our goal someday is to bring 10,000, small fraction of the people living with these diseases and their families." And he said, "John," he said, "you bring 10,000 rare disease advocates to the Hill, you'll get whatever you want." So
there's a goal.
Keep that in mind.
Yeah, no. So how much do you think, when looking at this sort of systemic barriers, that, we hear all of the time concerns about the cost of drugs, these, especially biologics, that are possibly very meaningful, but this idea that the system will break, that they can't handle the cost of drugs. How much do you think that plays a role in the barriers?
They're right on the math, Sharon.
Yeah.
It's great that we have these wonderful, oftentimes now miracle drugs, and they cost $1 million, $2 million, $3 million for these gene therapies. That math doesn't work, right? So now we need to ask the question, okay, why do they cost several $1 million? Well, oftentimes it's the only available treatment, so there's no competition. And you think about what it takes to get there. You got to pay for all the failures along the way, then all the R&D. The average, even rare disease drug, costs nearly $1 billion to develop. So you got to recoup that research and development. You got to pay for future research and development. And I kind of come back to, well, let's look at the entire paradigm. How do we do clinical studies? When we were developing drugs at Amicus, lots of work, right? And you do all the preclinical work. By that point, we've already invested tens of millions of dollars in complex animal studies. Why do we do animal studies? Why do you need a 9-month monkey tox program? Let's ask that. Maybe sometimes you do, but oftentimes you don't. And here I do give credit. I give credit to Commissioner McCary and FDA. They're looking at that. They're looking at animal studies. What does it take? All the requirements to get in the clinic. You don't have that in Australia. You don't have that in other countries, and you don't see patients, dying, suffering in phase 1, 2 studies. So let's just revisit the entire paradigm. But even when you get past the FDA, oftentimes then you got to go to the academic research centers, which is where you need to do your clinical work. I knew exactly what I had to do to get through the FDA. It wasn't easy, wasn't cheap. But once I got that clearance on the IND, then it was about a year to open my clinical sites. And it's hard to find rare disease patients. And now that thankfully we have many treatments, you got to get people sometimes who are naive to therapy. You've got to find people with certain subsets or mutations. My first phase 3 study in a disease, Fabry disease, relatively rare disease, we had to open 60 clinical sites on 6 continents to find 60 patients. Took me 2 years to enroll that study. You got to go through every IRB. You got to go through different contracting at different hospitals, ethics review boards. We could centralize and institutionalize much of that. And then how do we look at biomarkers, right? There's a lot of reluctance, a lot of questions increasingly around the use of biomarkers, not always appropriate. But again, we have to take a measure of risk here. to look at the standard, the regulatory standard, is a biomarker will support accelerated approval based, again, based on a biomarker or surrogate endpoint reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. Reason we have adjectives and adverbs there, call it a 51% standard, more likely than not. That means risk-taking. So again, there's so many different ways. So we've got an effort, the Milken Foundation, you guys have been incredibly involved in this. Let's just tear apart the system and think about why does it take so much time and cost so much money? We can do it better. So many people are going to Australia and now increasingly China for their phase 1/2 studies. That brings up serious concerns about undermining the viability of our biomedical research establishment. And at the end of the day, there is a great rivalry with China, as we all know, and it affects our national security. And I'm a firm believer that the world is a better place than everyone living in the world. The world is a better, safer, healthier, more prosperous place when the United States and our allies continue to lead in biomedical research. Great that biomedical research takes place in China or anywhere in the world, but we need to still be always at the vanguard. We can't cede that leadership of our academic centers, our biotech companies in particular.
So can we dig in a little bit on the FDA side? Because I
spend a lot of time at White Oak also.
I'm sure you do.
Harrison told me nothing about the FDA, so.
Yeah, well, I think we've all been struggling a little bit with some mixed signals from the FDA lately, but there's definitely reason for hope. The plausible mechanism, guidance sounds like it could be useful, although I would note that there's a requirement, if you dig in, for having extremely good natural history data to back this. So the plausible mechanism is helpful. The requirement for natural history data might actually negate that benefit, especially in an ultra-rare disease. And I'm wondering how you think about it and how the other companies in bio are thinking about the current FDA environment.
The FDA plays an incredibly important role, both as gatekeeper to make sure that medicines approved have that gold seal standard, that they've been proven to be safe and effective, and also as a beacon of innovation. We saw that in warp speed with the COVID vaccines, to be a partner, to be the ultimate referee and the gatekeeper, but to be that partner, to realize that part of the FDA mission is to accelerate biomedical research, not to be a barrier. There are two terrible outcomes here. One is the FDA approves nothing. The other is the FDA approves everything. So we still need that fair review standard, but what we've done though is to have a system that's evolved where you've got a basic framework of safety and efficacy, and that's applied to the rarest of diseases in similar ways to the most prevalent diseases where there is much less of an unmet need. What we really need is a regulatory review system that's reformed, modernized, that's not bureaucratic, that's grounded in science, and that looks at every molecule and every indication uniquely and makes a separate risk-benefit assessment. The FDA has all the tools to do that already. We as a society, Congress has given them all the tools to do that. I hate, Sharon, the phrase regulatory flexibility. When somebody says, oh, we'll be flexible in the rare neuromuscular diseases. We don't want flexibility because that's not sustainable. It brings even another level of uncertainty to the whole process. We need an elevation of regulatory science. How do you use Bayesian statistics? How do we designate and validate appropriate biomarkers? How do you use AI in the process as well? It's an elevation of regulatory standards. So I'm hopeful that, I spend a lot of time with the commissioner, senior leadership at FDA. We spend a lot of time talking about the entire ecosystem of newer, better medicines, vaccines, therapeutics, and particularly certainly rare diseases and neuromuscular diseases. I can tell you the commissioner gets it. The White House direction is they want more of these therapies. Even just 2 weeks ago, yes, plausible mechanism with a lot of work and footnotes. Again, just having an idea of how something may work should never be a basis for approval. But a part of this is elevating the culture at FDA to realize that the job is to find ways to approve medicines, stop them if they're not effective or certainly unsafe. But again, that customized approach. So the FDA has the tool sets. I think the commissioner has some bold ideas. I think we'll see more come. There's been so much change at the FDA. We've lost 20+% of the workforce. Thankfully now they did get last summer the authority and exemption from the Office of Management and Budget to hire over 1,000 new scientific reviewers. They've got over 400 offers outstanding. Anybody who wants to move into the world of regulatory science, I would encourage it. We need strong science, strong leadership, clinical expertise. So there's big gaps to fill. There's also gaps in that next level of leadership. The change that they made on Friday at CBER was long overdue and welcome. And we spend a lot of time publicly, but also behind closed doors, bringing in patients, researchers, entrepreneurs, biotech companies to show when things aren't working right. It shouldn't be so hard. It shouldn't take so long. Again, these are kind of the man-made problems. So I'm optimistic that we will see an increasingly positive FDA, and I think we'll know in the next 3 or 6 months.
So I'm wondering, because we spend a lot of time thinking about this. MDA's portfolio, is pretty large. So we cover over 300 different neuromuscular diseases.
I remember when it was 50.
It was 50. And
you and I met in high school 25 years ago, yeah.
Yes, and it turned out that those were categories of diseases.
Yes.
Those original 50 have expanded. And really only about 20 of the diseases in our portfolio are, quote, commercially viable. So the rest are ultra rare. And we spend a lot of time thinking, how do we align incentives to get drug approvals in ultra rare drugs? Not just the regulatory process, but what are the commercial incentives to do this? Or do we need to do this without commercial incentives? Is it at cost? I'm just curious.
I think we have to look at all the models. So it used to be that if a disease was fewer than 10,000 diagnosed people in the United States, you couldn't develop a medicine. And about 25, 30 years ago with Genzyme and others, that model changed. You're now to the point where if you've got a disease with 1,000, maybe 500, you can develop a business case for it. Below that, when you get into the low hundreds or dozens or the ends of one or handfuls, there is no business model. So there we do need public-private partnerships, different ways of thinking of advancing these therapies. But there are incentives that can help us get to these very rare diseases, one of which that's worked incredibly well is the Pediatric Priority Review Voucher Program. So you spend millions, tens of millions of dollars, develop a medicine that maybe there's 25 people diagnosed with it, but you get a golden ticket. And that golden ticket you're able to sell on a private market to a larger company, big pharma, big biotech company often, that has a, maybe not a rare disease medicine, a blockbuster, maybe a GLP-1, whatever it is, and it enables them to go to the FDA and say, I got this golden ticket, I need a faster review, 6 months instead of a year. And that extra 6 months has economic value to those big companies. So it's this private market system, costs the government nothing. And it's really been an inspiration for a lot of parents, families starting these companies. It expired a year and a half ago, and we worked with the patients, the communities, to get that, and thankfully was reauthorized in January, reauthorized till September 30th, 2029. So we got to go right back to the drawing board and get this authorized permanently. And again, ultimately, this was a bipartisan support. While it was passed in a Republican-only bill, we were able to bring in new advocates. So Senator Mark Wayne Mullen from Oklahoma, who's now going to be the Secretary of Homeland Security, met some families, and one young girl in particular with a rare disease, and he became an incredible champion for it. So again, the advocacy part of this is so important, to come up with different ideas, different business models, different incentive programs, private or public, and funding. When the threats were a year ago, we were all worried significantly, as we should have been, about 40% cuts to the NIH would have been devastating to the foundation of research. So many publicly argued. We spent a lot of time privately sharing the importance of what the NIH is, what it does. And you look at the budget that actually passed, the first Trump budget actually increased NIH funding.
Yeah, and it's
from 46 to 47
support.
billion.
Really
it was
helps.
Bipartisan. It will always be under attack, so we need to be vigilant. But I think that was a good example of fight and advocate so that we move on.
Yeah, we're certainly heavily involved in the fight for that, as well as the
Yes, you are.
reauthorization of the pediatric voucher. I wonder if you ever see a scenario in which that voucher would be expanded, because it would really be helpful in these ultra-rare disease scenarios. And a lot of the diseases that we cover wouldn't necessarily qualify for a pediatric voucher.
Yes.
They are, later onset or adult onset, but just as devastating.
Well, I think it should be. Yeah, I think it should be. Right now, it was hard enough to get it reauthorized for
Exactly.
the pediatric part of it. But I think it's a great model. Again, not costing the government anything. It's a private mechanism that will bring medicines to people faster.
And so one final question, I think, just to round out our talk here, is, over the years, how have you seen the role of advocacy organizations in drug development and change, and particularly in rare disease?
Oh, critical. It used to be, I go back to our early days in the MDA, it was very important research at the academic level. We didn't fund any companies, and then we put together that track, the Translational Research
Yes.
Advisory Committee, with you and I and a few others had the notion that we should be supporting early stage companies with meaningful grants, $1, $2, $3 million. And so we began to do that, and that funded some research that's actually now led years later to approved medicines. That was one part of the research, but also the advocacy. Nothing is more powerful. That virtuous circle of what it takes to make these newer and better medicines, Sharon, always at the center of that has to be people, families living with these diseases, our caregivers. We've got a great story to tell. MDA has done a wonderful job telling that story. We need to do much more of that to humanize who we are, what we do, and why we do it.
Thank you, and I'll let that be the last word.
Great, thank you.
Amazing.
Thanks,
Thank you
everybody.
so much.
God bless.
for joining us.